At this time, I want to turn it over to Anna-Lee and Julie. Thank you.
Thanks, Myrna. Thank you so much, Myrna Dawson, and then also to Myrna Kicknosway for helping get us started today and to put us in a good place. My name is Anna-Lee Straatman, and I'm a project manager at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and I've been looking after this project for 6 years. I want to acknowledge that I live on the land that is part of the traditional territory of the Chippewa, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Delaware Nations. And these nations, known as the Anishinaabe and the Lenape, agreed through their ancestral languages to the mutual sharing of the land and mutual responsibilities to the environment, land, and all peoples.
Thank you, Anna-Lee and Myrna, as well as Myrna. My name is Julie Poon. I am the research manager here at CREVAC, who I've also been working with Anna-Lee on this project, as well as Myrna and Peter and the rest of the CDHPI team. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that the land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And so with that said, Anna-Lee and I will sort of be setting the stage with our presentation for the rest of the day. Thank you. So in order to set the stage for day 3, we really want to focus on explaining first this research in this phase. So we'll start with conducting the research with survivors of domestic violence and loved ones of homicide victims, discussing some of the methodological challenges as well as the realities. And so I'm just going to start with some objectives first for phase 3, the survivor and proxy interviews. So our main objective really was to really understand the context around high-risk domestic violence within the 4 populations that the CDHPI focuses on, as they tend to have increased marginalization, resulting in increased vulnerability to domestic homicide. And so with our survivor and proxy interviews, we really wanted the interview narratives to highlight a number of things. First being risk factors associated with the populations involved, any barriers to help seeking, as well as any gaps in services and missed opportunities for intervention. So we really wanted to hear what the survivors and proxies had to say in terms of what didn't work, as well as what did work in terms of effective practices and policies for them. We also wanted to hear any recommendations for practices around prevention. And overall, we were really hoping that this stage of the research with these interviews would really provide both the survivors and others who knew of a loved one that was killed in the context of domestic homicide, really that opportunity to share their perspectives and have their voices heard. And so I'll just turn it over to Anna-Lee.
Thanks, Julie. So designing the research. This phase of the research was probably the one that required the most planning and consultation, and we certainly took full advantage of the expertise of our partners and collaborators. We met with them at partnership meetings in 2017 and 2018 to plan how we would conduct this phase of the research. And it was at these meetings that we sought input on the research protocol and the narrative interview that was developed by Diane Crocker and Kate Rossiter, 2 of our co-investigators. Once we'd settled on an interview structure and guide, we conducted some practice interviews with a survivor friend who allowed us to record the interview and use it for training purposes. In June 2019, we assembled a team together of research coordinators and students to conduct training on the interview guide and protocol. And the training included hearing from survivors about non-clinical interviews they might have had with media or police or other people, and what that experience was like, and to give us some context about what kinds of questions were okay to ask and what didn't rub well, right? And the training also included hearing from survivors about non-clinical interviews, understanding perspectives and experiences of Indigenous and immigrant populations, and dealing with vicarious trauma. We continue to conduct some practice interviews among the research team and with some survivors to make sure the protocol was right and did help because it did lead to some changes along the way. Julie?
Perfect. Thanks, Anna-Lee. So as this was all happening, we were also putting together ethics applications to get us ready to get to the point to be able to interview survivors as well as others that knew someone of a loved one who died in the context of domestic homicide. And so in doing this, we had a number of conversations when submitting our application to the research ethics boards that we were submitting to. I won't go through all of their concerns or their inquiries, but I did highlight a few of them here on this slide. So the first being the security of online platforms, such as Zoom, WebEx, and Skype. So we wanted to give our participants as many options as possible in terms of how they wanted to be interviewed. And so one of those options was to allow them the option of being interviewed through video conferencing. And if you keep in mind that this was happening pre-COVID, it wasn't necessarily as common as it is now in research to be interviewing through some sort of online platform. And so that really sparked a lot of discussion going on between ourselves, the research ethics boards, as well as a lot of discussions with Western's technology services and the University of Guelph's computing and communication services, who all really weighed in on the security of these platforms. And ultimately, we decided to go with Zoom as the most secure. The second primary inquiry was in relation to the potential for us to be ordered by a court to provide participant information from the project. And so we had a lot of lengthy discussions with the legal department here at Western University, and we made sure to make it very clear to all potential participants, as well as in the consent forms, that our position was that if this were to occur, we would do whatever was necessary to resist disclosure. Luckily, that we didn't end up having to do that, but if we did, we were definitely prepared in that respect. And then the last inquiry, the primary inquiry, was that there were questions that came up regarding Indigenous community engagement and participant privacy, which we were able to address in collaboration and consultation with our Indigenous partners and collaborators. And so ultimately, after all of that, we were able to get our R&B certificate first from Guelph in March 2019, shortly followed by Western, and then our 11 co-investigator affiliated universities, as well as 2 territorial licensing bodies. So it was a lot of work, but we managed to do it. And along the way, after we had received our certificates, we did engage in a number of amendments. I won't go through all of them, but the primary one is with the changes that were taking place with COVID-19, we decided that it was really timely and relevant to add in a new question or a new couple of questions into our interview guide in April 2020 to really get at what participants would say in terms of what they would do differently in the era of COVID-19 to manage the violence during that time, and what advice they would potentially give to someone that was in that scenario right now. And so turn to Anna-Lee.
Thank you for that, Julie. And I just want everyone to know that Julie quarterbacked that whole ethics experience. And I was so thankful that she did it, because that was not a job that I wanted. And she rocked it, honest to God. So we got it all. We got ethics approval. We were ready to rock and roll. And so in September 2019, we held press conferences in 4 regions of the country to raise awareness of the research and to encourage survivors to come forward to share their stories. The press conferences and events were held in Montreal at Concordia University, in London, Ontario, in Thompson, Manitoba, Fredericton, New Brunswick, and at a wellness camp in the Northwest Territories. And all received really good media coverage. A subsequent launch was hosted in Vancouver in December 2019, coinciding with the December 6th activities. We had decided to try to make this as national as possible, so we're really grateful to all of our partners for taking a role in helping us to promote this across the country. Julie.
Thanks, Anna-Lee. So once we were able to launch, as you know, there were a number of participation criteria that we had organized. which are up on the slide. So first and foremost, in terms of recruitment, initially, we required that all survivors identify with one or more of the four populations that you see on the screen: Indigenous, rural, remote, and northern, immigrant and refugees, as well as children exposed to or killed in the context of domestic violence. So we required that of all of our survivor interviews. Originally, we had had the same requirements for the proxy interviews, so those that had known of a victim of domestic homicide. However, what we were finding as we were going along with the research and recruitment is that we were getting a lot of proxies that didn't necessarily have experiences that fell under those four populations, but that really wanted to share their experiences. And so we decided to broaden the pool in that respect to anyone that was close to a victim of domestic homicide from any population in Canada. In addition, participants had to be 18 years of age or older to participate. It was really important to us that they were currently safe and free from domestic violence, and we had a number of screening questions that sort of got to that. We also wanted to make sure that all criminal proceedings, any coroner or medical examiner cases were completely closed out and had ended. And we wanted more recent experiences. So we were looking for experiences that occurred between 2006 to 2016. And then lastly, because we really wanted to capture the narratives of those participants, we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture them accurately. And so we asked that all participants be willing to have their interview audio recorded. And so because this research was so broad on a national scope, we separated everything out into taking more of a regional approach. And what we mean by this is that we separated it into a number of different regions, that being British Columbia, the Territories, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, as well as Atlantic Canada. And we had research coordinators that represented all of the regions. Their responsibilities were essentially to conduct screenings based on that participant criteria that I just spoke about previously. And so more specifically, asking questions about the potential participants' situation related to domestic violence or domestic homicide, ensuring or asking whether or not they currently had a support system in place, as well as just questions that really got to determine whether or not they were really ready to speak about the domestic violence or domestic homicide, because these are really difficult conversations to have. The research coordinators, once they determined if the participant was in a position or met the criteria to do a final interview, they were the ones that were also responsible for doing the nitty-gritty organizing and coordinating. Again, we really tried to accommodate our participants as much as we possibly could. And so, for example, one of the things that our coordinators would do is, for example, if we had an Indigenous a participant that really wanted to or would feel more comfortable being interviewed by an Indigenous interviewer, our regional research coordinators would coordinate that. With that said, interviews ended up occurring between August 2019 and December 2020. However, because of COVID-19, once March 2020 happened, we suspended all in-person interviews, and we switched all interviews to only strictly being by phone or by video conference. And I do want to mention that although I don't think that anyone could have ever predicted COVID-19, because we had really wanted to accommodate our participants as much as possible, and because we had all those thorough conversations with the various research ethics boards, we really were very prepared in that respect to transition straight into doing interviews by phone and by video conference. So we really didn't have any sort of like issues there in terms of when we had to suspend in-person interviews. And that was in part due to all the work that we did behind the scenes, as well as our awesome regional research coordinators across all of the regions. I like to call them the dream team. But yeah. And so I'll turn to Anna-Lee.
Thanks. So one of the things that was really important to us was to really take a trauma-informed approach to doing these interviews. And just to review, a trauma-informed approach, there are 6 principles, including safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, giving voice and choice, and considering cultural, historical, and gender issues. So some of the ways that we tried to honor these principles, we wanted to ensure the emotional and physical safety of our participants. If they were currently not safe, like they were still with the abuser, then we decided originally that it wouldn't be a good idea for them to participate in the research. Now, we did hold firm to that, but we let the participants decide whether it was safe to participate in an interview. We didn't determine their safety beyond that. Peer support, participants were invited to bring a friend to the interview for support if they wanted to. And where we really tried to focus our efforts was to make the interviews trauma-informed was the principle of empowerment, giving participants choice and voice. Participants got to choose where the interview would take place, online or in person, who they would speak with, such as a male or female interviewer or Indigenous interviewer, as Julie mentioned earlier. And during the interview, with the narrative approach, we tried to give participants as much control as possible. They led the story, they decided what they wanted to talk about, they were free to take breaks or stop at any time, not answer questions, and we tried to accommodate their schedules. We even offered childcare up until COVID happened during the interview time if necessary. We provided training to the people conducting the interviews on cultural and historical considerations of Indigenous and immigrant people so that they would have some awareness of the concerns that our participants might want to raise or talk about, and gave them the opportunity to talk about this context within their interviews. Interpreters were also made available for those who requested one so that participants could speak in the language of their choice. So as much as possible, we tried to adhere to these principles and to try to let our participants lead in how they were going to do this research. Julie.
Thanks, Anna-Lee. And so ultimately, once interviews started going, we ended up with an overall sample of 127 interviews with survivors of severe domestic violence, as well as proxies or those who had known someone that was killed in the context of a domestic homicide. And so here on the screen, you'll see the breakdown in terms of the 4 populations that the CDHPI focuses on. And then there were also quite a number of instances where the participants discussed intersecting identities in relation to their experiences with domestic violence or domestic homicide. And so you'll see that at the bottom of the screen. And here you'll also see the regional breakdown. As you can see, in terms of that breakdown, we were able to conduct interviews across all of the regions that we had focused on in Canada. And then when turning to the relationship the relationship type at the time of the violence, here you'll see from our sample that the majority of the survivors and victims were either married or common law in the relationships at the time that were spoken of in the interviews. And so I'll turn it to Anna-Lee.
Thanks, Julie. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges. And Julie's hinted at some of them, and I've hinted at a couple of them as we went along. And as with any project, although we thought we were prepared, there were some challenges we faced. So number 1, balancing the expectations of those who did not meet eligibility criteria but wanted to have their voices heard. Oh, God. This was so difficult. I think I can speak on behalf of all the regional coordinators who conducted the screening interviews that this was really challenging. I found it personally so difficult. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know how to say, no, you don't really fit in the parameters of our process, and that was but we had put in some parameters, as Julie mentioned, regarding the time frame and safety. But really, everyone's story is significant, and it's difficult to tell someone that their experience doesn't fit or it isn't what we were looking for. So we changed the protocol to enhance the screening interview to allow women to tell their stories in an abbreviated way. But we wanted, because every story is important and needs to be heard. Defining safety. Okay, that was fun too, because we had to balance our preconceived idea of safety. So, they're not in an abusive relationship anymore, with their idea of safety. Some women who were in shelter or recently out of shelter felt that they were safe because of where they were. And our original definition wasn't quite that way. It said that they should be out of an abusive relationship for a year or more. We quickly learned that, similar to risk assessment, safety is fluid and it is truly in the eyes of the beholder, and it wasn't up to us to judge. And another eligibility criteria that we originally established was that regarding ongoing court proceedings, that people with them would be screened out. Yeah, that wasn't going to work very well either. We quickly realized that this would screen out a lot of women with children. As you will hear from survivors later, many abusers use family court in particular as a means of controlling or maintaining contact with their former partners. Many women described being held up in family court proceedings until their children aged out of the system. So we changed it and went from from all court proceedings to criminal court proceedings. And those in family court, as long as they felt it was safe to do so, then we had them continue with their participation in this study. We originally were going to focus our interviews only on family members or loved ones of domestic homicide victims, as this was basically the focus of this research study from the beginning. However, there were very few people who wanted to come forward to speak of their loved one's death. And as Julie mentioned earlier, some didn't, then there might not have been very many that fit in the vulnerable population category that we were looking for. So, and some had limited knowledge of the abuse that the person had experienced before their death. We are glad that we opened up the study to include living survivors of domestic violence. Many of them, as you've heard in the videos, faced horrible experiences and near-death experiences. And they have so much that we can learn from. And so we wanted to learn from them how they've survived. There was also, as we mentioned, there was some limited intersectional representation. We tried our best. We didn't necessarily manage to get all of the 4 populations that we identified equally represented in the study, but we are very happy with the participation that we did get. Okay, Julie, challenges due to COVID-19. Okay, well, things were going pretty good with this study. We had been collecting data for about 6 months when COVID put a stop to pretty much any research activities. But as Julie has mentioned earlier, we were luckier than most in that we had already included in our protocol the ability to conduct interviews by phone or audio video conference. So thank goodness that she did all the slugging to get this done, because it really didn't provide the disruption for us that it did for a number of other people. But there were some challenges in adapting anyway. It's so hard to think that 1 year ago, that meeting by Zoom was new and unusual, and now it's almost commonplace. Some people were reluctant to participate in interviews, though, in the virtual world, which is totally understandable. And you're having to meet somebody online without knowing anything about them and then share very intimate details. So not something very easy to do. When we did conduct interviews virtually, we did struggle, as I'm sure many are, continually with low bandwidth and poor connectivity. The other challenge and unfortunate thing was our partners in Manitoba had opened the research with a ceremony with their Indigenous partners to make sure that the process got off to a good start. But those plans had to be put aside given the ongoing challenges and restrictions imposed due to COVID. Okay, so next slide. Participant engagement and what this has meant to our participants. We are honored to have been able to speak with and learn from so many survivors of domestic violence and loved ones of homicide victims. We learned from many participants about how they felt empowered just by participating in this research. They felt it was important to tell their stories so that others can learn from their experiences and hopefully prevent other people from going through what they did. And really, they wanted to help educate service providers and hopefully create change. They really wanted to know what the results of this research would be. And so we committed to share those results with them. And one of the ways we've done that is by hosting this conference. And we've invited all of our participants to attend. And we're very grateful that many of them have chosen to do so. And so honored that they also agreed to share their story even more publicly through the videos that you've been seeing in the last few days. At the end of each interview, we asked participants how they felt about participating in the interview and if they had had any concerns. Would they actually do it again? Would they recommend it to somebody else? What was the experience like for them? And we have a quote here that I think speaks to their engagement and interest in this project. I know this is going to help somebody to be a part of a study that's really going to contribute to some tangible changes. I'm happy to do it. It makes me happy that if nothing else, at least the story can go towards helping make some changes. I really hope we live up to that. Okay, the themes from the interviews. Goodness. There were a number of themes that came out of the interviews, and some of them you've heard in the videos that have been played during the conference, such as leaving is a process, it can happen to anyone, how do you find help, how do race, customs, and culture perpetuate violence in a relationship or even impede help-seeking activities. There were so many themes, and there's so much that we're going to learn, and we have a lot of work to do to get through all of those interviews and continue to share what we have. But we will hear some very interesting presentations this afternoon, and the themes that will be explored all come from the interviews that we did. Julie.
And so we just want to thank everyone. Anna-Lee was awesome as a regional research coordinator of Ontario, as well as the project manager for the whole CDHBI research, as well as this particular phase. Our survivors, as Anna-Lee was saying, they've touched us and touched our lives in so many ways. They've given us such insight into their lives and helped us to hopefully be able to do something with this research and do some justice. And just everyone on the team.